So today we're going to look at who were the original recipients of the letter from Yochanan, which contained the revelation which God gave to Yeshua, who in turn gave it to his angel, who in turn gave it to Yochanan, who in turn gave it to those under his care, who then gave it to the rest of us. So Revelation chapter 1 verse 4 says, from Yochanan to the 7 Messianic communities in the province of Asia. So I'm reading from the Complete Jewish Bible. Others have slightly different versions there, different expressions. All right, the 7 assemblies in the province of Asia. The word assemblies in the Greek is ecclesia, and that's been translated as churches in most of our English translations for the last 400 years. The meaning of the word Kyriakos could be understood by its root of kurios, which means the Lord's or the Lord. Thus, Kyriakos, that is the church, means pertaining to the Lord. It refers to something that pertains to or belongs to a Lord. The Greek Kyriakos eventually came to be used in the Old English form as kurik or kuriki, and then eventually as kirka, and then eventually it became church. Yes?
Okay, so ecclesia is the equivalent of kehillah, an assembly.
Ecclesia, we haven't got there yet.
Okay.
Well, we probably have on the screen,
This
but I'm not there yet. I'm still talking about the Kyriakos.
So church comes from kuriakos,
Yes.
which means pertaining to the Lord. So
Means
a group that is governed by a Lord.
Governed by a Lord,
So,
belonging to a Lord. Yep.
The Church of England is the kurios of England, under the governing
Of the Queen of England. Yes,
right, okay.
something like that.
It doesn't necessarily mean assembly.
No,
It just
not
means
necessarily, yeah.
a group under a Lord.
A group under a Lord, yep.
Right.
A church is then correctly something that pertains to or belongs to a Lord. In its Christian context, it could be pertaining to or belonging to the Lord Jesus Christ. So, in a way, in a Christian context, it's not wrong to say the church, okay, because it belongs to the Lord, if you use it in that context. However, the Greek word kuriakos does appear twice in the New Testament and apostolic writings, and the first time is in 1 Corinthians 11:20, where it refers to the Lord's Supper, and once again in Revelation 1:10, where it refers to the Lord's Day. So translating ecclesia as church, which belongs to Yeshua, is not entirely correct or not entirely wrong or evil, but it is not entirely correct or accurate either. You can refer to the church, but if you read the scriptures and you call the word ecclesia church, it is an incorrect translation. It is the incorrect use of the word kuriakos. It should be the word ecclesia.
And that's the reference in the book to the ecclesia.
It is, yes, the ecclesia, yeah. In the book of Revelation.
Yes.
And everywhere else in the apostolic writings, except for those 2 places where it can be translated as the Lord's, not church.
Right.
Because it belongs to the Lord, that word.
But there he's talking about assemblies, to these assemblies.
These assemblies, yes.
Okay.
So what have I got here? The true translation of the word ecclesia in its correct context has been replaced with the word church in order to distinguish between the old religion and the new religion that Jesus started. And that was why the word church was used in the apostolic writings. So they can give that clean break from the Old Testament people and the New Testament people. So what should the word be? Well, I've got it up there. The word ecclesia is also used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Tanakh, what is commonly called the Old Testament. There the word is translated as the Hebrew word kahal. So ecclesia is the translation of the word kahal in the Hebrew. Kahal equals ecclesia. Where does a kahal first appear? In the book of Exodus, where it is first used to describe the assembly of the children of Israel. Exodus or Shemot 12:6 says, "And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening." That's the evening sacrifice. So the same ecclesia or kahal is what Yeshua says he will build on the revelation that Shimon Peter had in the Matthew chapter 16, where Yeshua says, "And I also say to you that you are a rock, and upon this rock I will build my," not church, "I will build my assembly." Because the reference is the reference point back in Exodus. Yeshua did not say he would build a church. He said he would build his community, his kahal, the same one that was referenced back in Exodus and every other reference in the Tanakh. The other thing we need to be conscious of, and I'm taking a bit of a side here, is the word for build is oikodomio. Oi, oi. It can also mean to confirm in a figurative sense. So the passage in Matthew 16:18 could easily be read, if you take off the replacement theology classes, as this: "On this rock I will confirm my assembly," the one that I started back in Exodus, the children of Israel. It's not a new thing that he built or started. It's a confirmation of the assembly that started back in Exodus that he will confirm and rebuild and renew. The problem is when you translate this passage and all the other passages with the word where it should be ecclesia and replace it by the word kuriakos, church, you end up confirming that Yeshua or Jesus came to start a new thing, because the church is different to the kahal that he started in the wilderness. The nation of Israel and us who are grafted in, the nations, is what he came to fix, is what he came to confirm and re-establish, so to speak, because Judaism or Israel has kind of lost its way a bit at the time of Yeshua. Now, I don't have the reference from the sages, unfortunately, and I have got Dr. Doug looking for this, and hopefully I'll have it to you by next week. But Judaism acknowledges that it requires the wild branches that are grafted in for the natural tree to be healed. Rabbi Shapiro quoted it, but he actually didn't quote or reference what he quoted. So I'm trying to source that reference. Back to the book of Revelation. The original audience then of the book of Revelation was the 7 assemblies of believers that Yeshua came to confirm as being his. And Yochanan was the apostolic overseer of these assemblies. And these assemblies consisted both of Jews and those from the nations. Some who had undergone full conversion, others who were grafted in and participating in the Shabbat, in mitzvot observance, and other ways of Jewish life to the best of their ability at the time. They took on whatever they could, as the Didache says. If you can't do the full observance, take on whatever you can. And that's what this assembly was doing. So we have a whole range of group of people that are fully Jewish, to converts, to those from the nations participating in Shabbat, in the mitzvot, in whatever they could at the time. The believers from the nations were actually a part of the assembly of the Jews, worshipping the one and only true God. And this is a contributor to the problem that the book of Revelation addresses. And we will see why as we look at the historical context a little bit more. So in order to understand this, let's have a look at some history around that time. The Roman Emperor Vespasian, he was the governor of the Roman Empire between 69 and 79 CE. But in 66 CE, Vespasian was appointed to suppress the Jewish revolt that was underway in Judea. They had a couple of revolts over the history, just after Yeshua's time. This was one of the earlier ones. During this time, he became the patron of Flavius Josephus. He became the patron of Flavius Josephus, a Jewish resistance leader captured at the siege of Yodfat, who would later write his people's history in Greek. So we've quoted Josephus a few times already. He wrote several books, and he's classed or considered to be a traitor in Judaism because he actually sided with the Romans after he got captured. But he still wrote Jewish history, and pretty accurate Jewish history, which lines up with other Jewish historians. So over the 4 years after Vespasian's appointment to subjugate Jerusalem, thousands of Jews were killed, and the Romans destroyed many towns and re-established control over Judea. They also took Jerusalem in 70 CE, the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. Vespasian is remembered by Josephus, who was writing as a Roman citizen at the time, in his book, Antiquities of the Jews, as a fair and humane official, in contrast to the previous and more notorious Herod Agrippa II, and he's mentioned in the book of Acts. He's the one that questioned Rav Shul at Caesarea. And also, Josephus goes into great lengths to demonize this Agrippa, because he wasn't really the nicest person either. Anyway, Vespasian, after he conquered Jerusalem, enacted 2 severe measures against the Jews because of their rebellion. Firstly, he enacted a punishing type of penalty on the Jewish household throughout the Roman Empire in the form of a tax called Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax, in other words. So we have a picture of the Jewish tax. 2 drachma was the poll tax on every Jew every year. And that was quite a heavy burden. Oh, we've lost our overhead person. That was quite a heavy burden for a Jewish household to pay, especially with those that had several children. And Jewish households had up to 10 children in those days because of the huge death rate they were suffering from the persecution. They were trying to repopulate the Jewish race. This tax was specifically to the Jews. No one else in the entire empire had to pay it. It was an annual reminder that the Jews were under Roman rule after the rebellious efforts. So you've got to keep that in mind. Vespasian levied this tax specifically for the temple of Jupiter, the temple of Zeus. And it was a symbolic gesture, I've got here jester, a symbolic gesture to indicate that the God of Israel had been defeated by the God of Rome. That's what that tax represented to the Romans anyway, to suggest that, hey, finally, the God of Zeus, the God of Jupiter, the God of Zeus, has overcome the God of Israel. So, cough up your money as a reminder. In addition to this tax, Vespasian also began a campaign to prevent the return of the Messiah by hunting down and killing the descendants of the house of David. Anyone with Davidic blood in his or her veins was to be killed. Now, one of the things that we read here, it's probably a bit early, but I'll bring it in now. Let no foreigner sit on his throne or allow others to continue to inherit his honor. For in your holy name you swore to him that his lamp will not be extinguished for all eternity. That is the household of David. When we read this for the reading of the prophets every week, we re-establish the fact that while Vespasian tried to wipe out the lineage of David, he couldn't, but he tried. Eusebius, the 4th century historian, says this in his ecclesiastical history. He says, after the conquest of Jerusalem, Vespasian gave orders that everyone from the lineage of David should be sought out in order that none of the royal race might be left among the Jews. Because of this, a most terrible persecution hung over the Jews. So this is not that book. It's not in this quote, but Eusebius, A Church History, is a good read, and we'll probably refer to this a little bit more next week because there's some interesting things in there that relate to the book of Revelation. Now, this all happened around 70 to 73 CE, Common Era. Some 20 years later, Vespasian's son Domitian took over as the emperor during the 90s, and he basically bankrupted the entire Roman Empire. Yeah, he partied hard and blew it all. A 90s kid, exactly. It's important to note that the Roman religious system included the worship of the emperor, who was said to be a god. Domitian's father and brother, Titus, were both from the army, and they were both not religious men. So they didn't push that emperor is God thing very much at all. However, Domitian was different. He was a very religious emperor, and he especially honored Zeus and Jupiter and restored the temple of Zeus, which had burned down during Titus's reign. That's his brother. He even covered it with a golden roof. Do we know another place that's covered with a golden roof? Somewhere in Israel? Not only did he revere the gods more than his predecessors, but he also referenced himself as a god, more than his father and his brother did. Neither of them took the concept of a Roman emperor being God too seriously, but Domitian did, very much like Nero. In fact, people thought he was another Nero, or the spirit of Nero was upon him. Domitian brought the emperor cult back to the forefront of Roman rule, and he decorated the cities with his image. On every street corner, there was a statue of him, some decorated in gold and silver. He built a temple dedicated to the Flavian household, the Flavian being his family name. So you can see there, why did I put lots of little statues of Domitian on there? Because that's what it would have been like around his time. He demanded that everyone in the Roman Empire had to address him as, are you ready? My Lord and my God, Domitian. He also had a sadistic streak about him, which was very similar to that of Nero. Now, since Domitian bankrupted the entire empire, he needed to raise some money. So the first place he looked was Jewish tax, which was a regular source of income for the empire. When he did this, he discovered that some Jews had been concealing their identity as Jews in order to avoid paying the fiscus Judaeus, the Jewish tax. These people were tax evaders. So he ordered an investigation to find these tax evaders. And he encouraged his citizens to report anyone that they suspected of being secretly Jewish. That is, hiding the fact that they are Jewish to avoid paying the fiscus Judaicus. How many times have we seen this played out in history, where you have to dob in your neighbor for being a Jew? Throughout history, from almost day one, right? But this investigation uncovered something very surprising. He received not just hundreds, but thousands of accusations, not about Jews who were evading the taxes. Instead, these people were identified as Gentiles who had drifted into Jewish ways all over Rome, the capital, and the entire empire. These people were God-fearing believers from the nations who had abandoned their old ways and begun to worship the God of the Jews. They were keeping Shabbat, they were worshiping in a Jewish manner, doing the prayers, what we did after the service today, that's what they were doing. every week, 3 times a day. Roman history records these people as those who drifted into Jewish ways. From the Roman perspective, these people were illegal. They were illegal Jews hiding their Jewishness to avoid taxes. The other problem was that although Judaism was a legal religion, it was only legal for Jews to practice. In fact, if you were not a Jew by birth or full conversion, it was illegal for you to practice Judaism. Who else was trying to tell us that we can't practice Judaism as Gentiles? Not naming any groups or whatever. Not to be Jewish and practice Judaism in those days was called, this is interesting, atheism. To believe in the God of Israel was considered to be atheism by the Romans.
That's so good. I love that.
So Domitian was appalled at good Roman citizens and other Gentiles in the empire forsaking the gods, in gods we trust, forsaking the gods because the Roman religion had many gods, and adopting one God, monotheism, or in their terms, atheism. Worshipping the one true God of Israel. So as a result, he launched another wave of persecution against the Jews because they were luring and seducing these good Roman people into their religion of atheism. Shame, shame, shame on those people. The interesting thing is that he even finds people in his own household, those closest to him, that have drifted into this atheistic way. His cousin, his niece, their 2 little boys who Domitian actually adopted as his own, and one of them was going to take on the throne as the heir of him. They had also become a part of this body of believers. Yes, interesting. Only 60 years after the resurrection, and the believers had gone all the way into the ruling house of Rome.
This really
This sets a great scene for the book of Revelation. So this, of course, ticked Domitian off to no end, and he sets out to punish the Jewish communities when some of the Jewish prominent leaders stepped up and said, hang on, you shouldn't be punishing all the Jewish people for what a small group, a small cult of Jewish people is doing. It was only a small portion that practiced Judaism. The sect of the Nazarenes, the Jews and the Gentile believers in Yeshua, they're the ones that actually deserve the punishment. So Domitian listened to the Jewish leaders, cancelled his original edict, and made a new one calling on people to dob in the, so to speak, Gentiles who were practicing Judaism illegally. Just like the Hasidic Jews went through at the same when they started, exactly.
Not exactly the same.
Well, similar, yeah. Yep. He reinforced the position that the practice of Judaism was only legal for tax-paying Jews. It is therefore not legal for Gentiles who were practicing Judaism, and so these people were to be arrested, their possessions seized by the state, and if they were an aristocrat or a nobleman, they would be exiled or banished to a remote island off the coast of Italy or one of those other islands. But if you were not an aristocrat, you would be put to death. The type of death that they're talking about included poisoning and boiling in oil or some other liquid that would boil. Some were put in from the beginning, you know, like the frog in the boiling water trick where you sit there cold water and slowly heat the water up and then you boil. Others would be dumped into a boiling vat head first. This was typically a public spectacle, so everybody could come along and see what was happening. The weird thing is, this type of public execution lasted to the 1600s. Only 400 years ago, 500 years ago, was it declared illegal. Shocking. Anyway, church tradition, and I'm using the word correctly here, as the writers of some of these early books were no longer actually associated with the Messianic community, but with the church that had separated itself from the Messianic community. Church tradition tells us that Yochanan, who was the last living apostle, or Shliach, was eventually found by Domitian in Ephesus. He was originally given poison to drink, but as Yeshua told his disciples, if you drink any poison, it will not hurt you. He walked away from that. Well, he couldn't walk too far because they then decided to boil him in oil. And as you can see there's Yochanan going, now what? Because the boiling oil didn't work either. So, neither of these two methods of killing a non-nobleman worked. As a result, Yochanan ended up on the Isle of Patmos because they couldn't kill him, so they had to banish him to exile. And that is where the book of Revelation was eventually given to him down this succession of revealers, so to speak. Now, all of this persecution, initially against the Jews and then against the Jewish believers, the believers in Yeshua that came from the nations, gives us the context to the book of Revelation. But there is more. Domitian also renewed his father's campaign against the house of David, waging war against the house of David, the legitimate dynasty over Israel, because he was afraid of Jewish monotheism, and he thought this monotheism was angering his gods. But more importantly, he was also afraid of the house of David and the link that it had to the coming of the Messiah. So what did... Sorry, I'll repeat it. So Domitian also renewed his father's campaign against the house of David, waging war against the house of David, the legitimate dynasty over Israel, because he was afraid of Jewish monotheism, and that monotheism was angering his gods. But more importantly, he was afraid of the house of David and the link it had to the coming Messiah. So what Domitian did, so what did Domitian know about the Jewish Messiah? Domitian had a Jewish advisor. Can anyone remember his name? Josephus. That's right. He's a historian, but he was also an advisor. Flavius Josephus.
Oh, same last name.
Yeah, interesting that, isn't it? Maybe he changed his last name because he came under the house of Flavian. When Domitian's father Vespasian was at war with the Jews, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, some of you might know that name from Jewish history, prophesied that Vespasian would be the next emperor of Rome. And that did happen, right? The problem is that Josephus went even further and declared that the prophecies about a coming Messiah were fulfilled in the house of Vespasian. Did I say Vespasian before? Vespasian. So here we have a Jewish prophet who's jumped over to the Roman side, prophesying that the coming Messiah will come from the house of Flavius, the Vespasian household. Very interesting. This is why Josephus was considered to be a traitor by the Jewish people. As I said before, that doesn't mean his account of history is wrong, but definitely his account of prophecy was wrong.
This is so interesting.
So according to Josephus at the time, the prophecies about a coming Messiah were fulfilled in Vespasian and Titus, that was his son, and ultimately in Domitian, which was Titus's brother, Vespasian's other son. Josephus effectively appointed the Flavian household into the position of Antichrist, one who stands in the place of Messiah. Josephus effectively appointed the Flavian household into the position of Antichrist, one who is in place of Messiah. because he said the Messiah would come from their lineage. Right? So all this is happening around at the same time. And this is why Domitian saw the heirs of the household of David to be a legitimate threat to his own throne and position as Antichrist. Well, we say Antichrist, but he would say Messiah. But we say he's in place of Messiah. That's why he's called the Antichrist, someone who's in place of the Messiah.
This is truly the war of the gods.
This is the war of the gods happening, yeah. So this is the context of Yochanan being on the Isle of Patmos. He was in his 90s and still overseeing the 7 assemblies of believers, both Jews and those from the nations, originally from Ephesus and then from exile. And while the banishment was a life sentence, Yochanan lived long enough to see the death of Domitian and was eventually allowed to return to Ephesus after the next emperor, whose name was Nerva. He released all the political prisoners and those that were incarcerated and banished.
Do you think that Josephus was being a double agent, or do you think he was being genuine? Do you think he was perhaps furthering the cause of the Jews in some way by being a source of misinformation?
Oh, in terms of becoming Messiah and
yes.
Persecuting the Messianic believers.
And saying that Domitian's house...
Possible, yeah. But after that, Bar Kokhba, who was a Jew, and he was in, can't remember the date now of his rebellion, but that came after that. So the Jews saw him as the Messiah. So I don't think they would have seen a Roman person as a Messiah, the legitimate Jews. But I think Josephus was just feathering his own nest, basically, so he would be nice and comfortable in a Roman environment. Because, you know, being an advisor to the Emperor of Rome, not a bad posse.
Yeah.
Hey? Yeah. So, possible, but I would say probably not.
Or perhaps he was the one who prophesied about the beast.
Sorry?
Maybe he was the one who prophesied about the beast. Yeah, he was there announcing the beast. He will be the Mashiach.
Yeah,
You Jews
possibly.
turn like a whore because he cheated on Hashem to go, I don't know. It's like all these pictures are now making more contextual sense. Even if it's not him, it could be someone like him.
Yeah, yeah. So the story of the persecution of the believers living in the 1st century CE provides the social, political, and historical context or backdrop of the book of Revelation. Once you understand the significance of Domitian's persecution, his restoring the emperor cult, and the tax on the Gentiles who practiced Judaism, you will then have the necessary information to provide a correct interpretation of the book of Revelation. Understanding what happened roughly at the turn of the century with the persecution and the tax helps us to understand one of the main contributors also to the separation between Messianic Jews and the Gentiles from the rest of Judaism. There were several contributors, and I just mentioned one of them. The claim that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. The Jewish believers in Yeshua who were still around at the time in Israel were told to also believe and worship believe that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And of course, the believers in Yeshua knew that Yeshua was the true Messiah. So those Jews that refused to believe that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah were actually banished from Israel. So the Jews were thrown out from Israel. But this happened after Domitian. This was, when was the Bar Kokhba rebellion? Around 150 or 170 CE. So it was about 50 to 60 years after Domitian, after the book of Revelation. But the thing that caused the separation between the Gentile believers those from the nations and Judaism, that thing was Domitian's persecution and the tax. Under the Domitian persecution, the only way the Jewish community could ever protect their own status with the Roman government was to expel the Gentile believers, because they were not allowed legally to practice Judaism. So they had to inform them to the authorities. These people do not submit to Roman authority, do not submit to the Roman God, because they're worshipping the God of the Jews, which is illegal. So they have to be dobbed in and removed. The believers suffered under Domitian more than they had with any other emperor, including Nero. And he was considered to be quite evil himself, Nero. His name will pop up again later on, though, the old Nero, when we talk about the number of the beast. Because of this persecution, the believers started asking themselves, could this be the one from the apocalypse, the Antichrist? Who else but the Antichrist is going to demand that he be addressed as my Lord and my God? The only way that a believer from the nations could avoid the death penalty, could avoid losing their heads, was to give in to the worship of the Roman god, Nero. Otherwise, the believers would be beheaded.
Is that water dripping from there, or is that spark?
It's only water. Thanks, Daniel. So let me repeat that. The only way that a Gentile believer in Yeshua who was practicing Judaism could avoid the death penalty, because they were doing something illegal, they were worshipping the God of the Jews. Only Jews could do that. The only way they could avoid the death penalty was to submit to the beast. I mean, the emperor of Rome, and accept him as my Lord and my master, my God. Domitian's image cluttered the streets of Rome and the whole empire, and he demanded worship of the people. He was considered to be a god at the time by the Romans. And as I said, the only way that the Messianic believers could avoid the death penalty was to submit to the image of this Domitian, the god of Rome. Now, Roman law protects the rights of citizens from torture, such as crucifixion or being boiled in oil. So a Roman believer in Yeshua the Messiah, who was practicing Judaism, would not be crucified or boiled in oil, because they were protected. Instead, they would be beheaded, which was a much faster and more merciful way of execution. Yep, preferred method. So believers with Roman citizenship were typically at the time off with their heads because of their testimony of Yeshua and the word of God, and they did not worship the beast or his image. Does it sound like a passage from Revelation chapter 13, verse 15? It was allowed to breathe into it the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak, and it was allowed to cause anyone who would not worship the image of the beast to be put to death. Revelation 13:10, if anyone is meant for captivity, into captivity he goes, to be exiled, like Yohanan. If anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. This is when God's holy people must persevere and trust. Revelation 14:9, and the third angel followed, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, Can we have that image of Domitian back, please? If any man worship the beast and his image, receive his mark on his forehead or in his hand. That's exactly what the believers had to do. Worship the image or the beast to be saved. So when we look at the beast in the book of Revelation, we can see how easily Domitian fits that picture. But, as I already mentioned, we will also see that a few others fit that picture as well. And even the number of the beast that we think is, I don't know, I'm not going to say his name, but we've come up with different numbers and different interpretations, but there's one that is quite interesting that we'll probably talk about next Beit Midrash.
I had a quick question. So I get the, I get the concept of them worshipping the image, but when it talks about a sign, is it just that they would then have to bear some kind of citizenship or an emblem of being a Roman citizen? Is that, or is it just purely like a metaphor?
When you say receive his mark,
yeah, just receive his mark on their forehead.
Any man, well, it doesn't on his forehead or on his hand. Receive a mark. Yeah, yeah. That's to be discovered more as we look at.
I'd really like to find out what that is, because that would set a foundation for something that is so obscure.
So we often talk about if we take on a particular money system, then that's the mark of the beast. But just because we take a particular money system or vaccine or something like that on, doesn't mean we're actually worshipping the image or worshipping that beast. It has to fit with scripture, where it says, any man worship the beast and his image and receive that mark. So there has to be a combination of things that fit this scripture. We can't just take part of it and say, oh, if I receive the vaccine or whatever, or if I receive the chip or whatever, that is the mark of the beast. You have to also be worshipping that thing, that image, that being. You have to deny Hashem, in other words. Yeah. Yeah. Right, so that's the context of the book of Revelation. So we think we've got persecution in our time? No, not at all. Yeah.
Having someone disagree is not persecution.
No.
I need a timeline for all this.
No, yeah.
Because Jews were thrown out of Rome by Claudius much earlier than all of this too.
Well, they were thrown out of Rome, yeah, and out of Israel, and they were thrown out lots of places, lots of times. Because Rav Shul writes to the believers in Rome, in his letter, you know, the book of Romans. So there must have been believers back in Rome at the time, both Jewish and those that are grafted in. So there was a on-off thing, you know. 1 minute they were hated, next minute they were loved. Depends on the emperor at the time.
I have a question. So all that history that you've mentioned and that you've put together, is that easily accessible? Is that something somebody can Google and find?
Well, yeah. There's it's in here. It's you can't necessarily find it in one package. I got this information from First Truth Design. Well, actually from Daniel Lancaster, who I almost copied word for word, but I didn't. I changed a few things here and there.
Yeah. Sorry, next thing. So
there's a series online that he's got on the Book of Revelation. There's the Apostles, the Chronicles of the Apostles, that has a lot of this. I've summarized a lot of this in here, but he references a lot of historical books to get to this point.
So basically, if you are like a scholar and you're studying you will come across those things.
Yes.
So
yeah.
How I still don't, I mean, I do understand, but it's interesting how all of this has been concealed or it's known, but people don't expose or talk about those things because otherwise you have to face the reality of where our roots are from and what happened, what truly happened. And I guess people don't want to do that.
Yeah. Let me read to you what Eusebius, the church historian, says under the heading of Jesus's predictions. Such was the reward for the guilt and impiety of the Jews against Christ of God. It is worth appending to it the infallibility prediction of our Saviour regarding these very things in his prophecy. Woe to those who are pregnant. Remember that one? Those nursing infants. And he says that this was fulfilled by Vespasian, actually, I think. All of this happened in the second year of Vespasian's reign, in accordance with the prophecies of Christ.
So he literally says it.
So he's basically saying that what Yeshua prophesied that we think is the end of end times, which it probably is as well, but it's already been fulfilled, word for word almost, in what happened around Vespasian's time.
So he was a church father, and he was confirming what you just.
He was a historian and a church father. Yeah.
Yes, but that's because when we study the history of the church, it's based not off the history, but off the interpretation of the word church. We received the Holy Spirit on that day. That's our history. We don't look at the historical documents. We look at what people have documented on the history.
Yeah.
So suddenly, those things are not relevant because now the church is born. That's
that's Jewish history. All of that's Jewish history.
Right.
We're not interested in Jewish history. We're interested in the church that was formed on the day of Pentecost and that history.
And then if you said, let's look at the church history people are interested in is the Protestant reform, but that's the reform on a history. So it's not looking at the history, it's looking how the history was changed. The church is actually just remodeling itself on a continuous cycle till it gets to where it is now, where it's in a bit of a disheveled state, and we're not sure who we are anymore.
Yeah.
And you look at our neighbors down the road, they're not the idea of being a modern holy roller, the modern heightened Pentecostalism has died out, and people are looking for something a little bit like this, so they're going to Liberty. And this isn't to say anything against them, they're really great teachers, but they're reformers. They're preaching on the ancient reformers of, what are they? Martin Luther type reformers. That's what they've gone back to because they realize we have to backtrack a bit.
Yeah, they're going back to their church history, whereas we're going even further back to the Messianic.
So that's where all people my age, the scholars, the psychologists, all those people, they're going there because they realize that is necessary to learn.
Which is interesting because Liberty used to be one of the holy rollers, didn't they? Yeah, I think. Well,
they have undergone reform.
Yeah, they have. Yeah.
But generally speaking, I think that we've missed out on the whole intertestamental period.
History-wise, context. Definitely.
In the mainstream of the churches.
Yeah. Lillian? That's okay.
So I have a query. So my query is he was earning Domitian was earning an income from taxing the Jewish people. What logic was there to kill them?
What logic was there?
Yeah.
So, I think, sorry, give the microphone to Daniel. He's got the good answer. No. Oh, you were killing for cash, did you say? No.
Killing the cash cow, yeah.
No, but that's the point. The Messianic believers from the nations were not Jews, so they didn't have to pay the tax. You see?
They were useless.
The Jews were paying the tax, so keep paying, guys. You're making plenty of money. But the believers that came from the nations who weren't Jewish, but were doing all things Jewish, right? Who were atheists because they were doing the Jewish things, they weren't paying tax because they were Roman citizens. They were from one of the other nations.
Right. But suddenly they stopped caring about what they lost. So they were this third group. So he could control the Jews, he could control Roman citizens, but people like us joining them, he couldn't control. So we needed to be destroyed because we're useless to him, right?
Yeah,
so,
we're right in the middle. We're not a Jew, and we're not a Roman citizen worshipping the God of Rome.
Yeah.
So what do you do with people like that?
Yes.
Get rid of them.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me now, because we didn't come under that order. We weren't submissive
Yeah, that's right.
to that order.
Yep.
Oh,
Those who wouldn't worship the beast, they were killed for their testimony of Yeshua, which is exactly what's written in the book of Revelation.
I'm just curious more than anything.
Kuriakos? No.
Curious. As to something building here, where does the Pope start coming onto the scene?
Oh, the Pope's still a while away yet.
Because he's with the Romans, isn't he?
Yeah. He comes around 300 years after Yeshua. So that's when the Roman religious system and the Roman government start to come together, and they say, well, hang on, here's a whole bunch of people. They're still out there, these believers in Jesus, and we're not making any money on them. Let's make the religious system into the state system. And so now you can start controlling the people that are in this religious system, because it comes under the state. You know the old saying, church and politics shouldn't mix? Well, in Judaism, it works okay, because the politics is actually based on, well, it's not politics, it's actually leadership, is based on Torah. It's based on a religious system. But outside of Judaism, if it's not based on a religious on Torah, then it will be controlling the religious system.
So what's that say about the current election then?
The current what?
What does that say about the current election and the current candidates then?
Yeah.
Something interesting. I just quickly wanted to add, when you mentioned at the beginning, when the word for church actually means, what was it, group under a lord?
It means belonging to the Lord.
Belonging to a lord.
Yeah.
When we say the Roman Catholic Church, it's a good thing you bring that up, because it's no longer belonging to Yeshua, it's belonging to the Roman Catholic system.
Yeah.
It does represent a system against who we are now. We are actually atheists in their eyes, because we're against that Roman Catholic system, which is kind of a mind-blown moment, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah.
Just changing speed, but how about John? Let's just put this man in oil, in tar. That'll kill him.
First, try and poison him.
We'll poison him. Okay.
Glug, glug, glug.
No.
Next.
But doesn't it remind you of Daniel and in the lion's den? You know, you know, there's God right in the thick of it, saying, "In my sovereignty, you will not perish."
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. And that's time and time again. You know, I just love that of God.
It's in Eusebius and also Josephus. I think he has that as well. A couple of the church historians have that. Yeah.
I just had a thought that what's happened once is going to happen again. Yeah. We had Rome persecuting the Christians, or Rome. Today, the great persecutor of Christians is the Chinese. And one wonders if we'll have a swing around there.
Possible. Yeah. Yep.
It's worth thinking about.
Watch this space.
Watch all the space.
Women pregnant or not, had to run and hide in caves. Yeah. They were going to be beheaded if you didn't yield to this God.
Yep. It just brings me back to those movies we saw back in the 70s. The guillotine coming down on people's heads. Image of the beast and.
So,
number of the beast.
Just asking again, will it be the same thing of a polytheistic system controlling or trying to control a monotheistic system? Would it be the same thing, or somewhat? That's true.
Hang on. There's lots of discussion that the guys online can't hear.
Yes. So. I think David has something to say first.
Yeah, but just finish off what you were saying.
I was just saying the end time church is a universal church where every denomination will be involved, including Buddhists.
So watch this space where Jews, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists all get together and say, let's create one faith and be you know, kind and believing and embracing of one another and our gods.
But that is close to what we should be doing, which is acknowledging them as being sons of Abraham, but not saying we worship the same. It's close but different.
Yeah. David, you've got a question or a comment?
Yeah, actually, well, that's like Reform Judaism. They accept God is whoever He is to you and can be anything. But one's from a couple of conversations ago. Sorry, yeah, someone must have asked. I think was that information about John? Is that historical? And is that what you were saying? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah, I just couldn't hear it.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. I think, what's the historical book that you're using there, Ralph, as a reference?
Eusebius.
Eusebius was one. And I question whether the historian Josephus as well.
Josephus. And there are a few others.
There are others as well.
I can make those available online, the list of references. Yeah. Yeah, we'll put the references online, yeah. I just wanted to mention about Yochanan. Have you guys got time? It's running. We're running late, but
I've got time.
No one's got time. There's no one coming in after us today, so
yeah.
I wanted to say about Yochanan. Now, I think I've mentioned this before, but I can't remember the context now. Yeshua says that so one of these will not see death before they see the coming of the Son of Man, right? And he was referring to Yochanan. But Yochanan died way before Messiah came, right? But notice what he said, you will see the coming of the Son of Man. What was his vision? His vision was the coming of the Son of Man at the end of the time. He saw that, and then he died afterwards. So he had to be kept alive until he got that vision. Otherwise, Yeshua's words would have gone amiss. Sorry?
He had to see Yeshua.
He saw his revelation, the Son of Man coming, you know, and the millennium and all of that, the Great Tribulation, all of that happening. He had to see all that because Yeshua said that there's some among you, and that was Yochanan, who will see the coming of the Son of Man before he sees death. Because he's the only one that was alive at the time of the vision from the original disciples. Yeah.
The original crew.
Yep. So look, next week we're going to study the beast a little bit more. So